So, hello everybody. Welcome to the next episode of the EMEA Recruitment podcast. As always, in partnership with our good friends over at Operation Smile. So today we're delighted to welcome David onto the podcast today, as my colleague Rose has explained earlier. So hopefully you can still hear and see me okay, David?
Yeah.
Perfect. So whereabouts do we find you in the world today? Well, location-wise, whereabouts are you?
So I am coming at you from my home in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is smack dab in the middle of the country, which has actually been an asset more than a liability for what I do. For one thing, there's a lot less going on than in New York City or Washington or somewhere like that. And for the other, it's halfway in this giant continent of North America. So it's a pretty easy flight to get anywhere that I need to travel to.
No, it's one of those things that it's almost impossible to have a conversation anywhere at the moment without mentioning the whole COVID situation. But you mentioned flying there, and I know that's something that people are getting used to, being on Teams and Zoom calls on a daily basis at the moment. So, I mean, how have you found life really since the whole COVID situation came around?
Yeah. So, I mean, if I'm being totally honest, I have to tell you a bit of personal background. So my wife is an ER doctor. Oh, wow. And so when COVID hit, like our approach was, we're going to get this fast. I went out and bought like 4 weeks of food from the grocery store, put it all in the freezer, et cetera. And was just like, you're going to get sick. You're going to get sick fast. We're all going to get sick. We're all going to recover. And then we'll move on with our lives. And it actually took several months before we finally got COVID. But kind of ever since then, our mentality has been, very little of what we could do puts us at more risk than just your job, right? Mm-hmm. So I feel bad saying that because, I recognize our experience has been very, very different, right? But that's kind of been the approach. And so we've done, the part of the country that we're in didn't lock down very hard except for the early summer. Most of it's interesting because most of my work over the last 2 years, really over the last 5, but all of my work over the last 2 years has been on remote teams and virtual teams and that sort of thing. And the part of the country we're in is most people are back at the office already, not full time. And I don't know that they're ever going to be back full time. But it's weird because it's a very different experience, not only from where we live, but also from our perspective of risk, right? Has been a very, very different experience. And in a weird way, like at first I was really, really freaked out by the idea of being tangentially involved in healthcare, but in a weird way, it's been kind of a blessing, right? Because we've been a lot luckier than most people, and so I don't count my blessings on that one.
Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, we're going to spend the podcast talking about your work and your background and how your background has led to the fairly recent book that you've produced. But I guess we can't ignore the fact that you mentioned your wife is in ER. So I mean, I guess huge respect and admiration for the work that she does. I mean, obviously, I can imagine that she's had a very stressful couple of years, really, in that role.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's been, in a lot of places in the U.S., every winter season gets really, really stretched. But certainly this has been a level of stretch that nobody was really anticipating. And so it's been really interesting to observe. It's been really difficult to be as supportive as you can be, et cetera. But again, it also gives you kind of, sort of an insider perspective on where the curves are moving, what's spiking up versus down, et cetera. We sort of get first peek at it to try and figure it all out, right?
Mm-hmm. No, this is true. Yeah, and I know. Good inside information close at hand for you.
Certainly we had much easier access to testing, which we were quite lucky to have, right? So.
And I guess you've sort of touched on this already, but typically when we get into this conversation on the podcast, I always try to ask the guests what positive experiences they've had through the 2 years and what things they've maybe learned about themselves that they can really take to the next stage of their lives. So if you reflect back on the last 2 years, anything that really stands out to you from a positive or learning point of view about yourself?
Yeah, well, so I'll give you two. One was probably really quite personal, which is, our schools, like a lot of places, our schools shut down in March of 2020. Unlike a lot of places in the US, our schools were back open that fall, but we really had about 4 months of not much to do, not much is open. So latter part of school and then all of the summer, and really a lot of time to interact and hang out with we have 2 boys. And so that sort of, I think, reiterates the importance of that family time. And I think this is true for a lot of people, right? We used to think that family, friends, those other elements of your life are something you squeeze at the margins around a 9-to-5 work day, 5 days a week, right? And then everyone's calendars got thrown in a blender, and you came to discover you're spending generous amounts of time with the people that you care about most. But prior to the pandemic, you haven't spent as much time as maybe you would have wished, et cetera. And so, I mean, that was an incredible blessing out of all of it. It also sort of led to that realization that, I mean, by summer of 2020, I was telling people, look, I don't know when the pandemic's over, but I know we're not going back to the office the way that we did. At the very least, the people who perform, who have talent enough to not need a job, right? Dan Pink, who you just had on a couple of weeks ago, was the one that said this great saying that I think is super true, which is that top talent needs organizations less than organizations need top talent, right? And they know that now. And so they're going to want a calendar that keeps those most important people of their life at the center of it, a calendar that actually reflects their priorities. And so by summer, not only was I grateful to recognize it, I realized a lot of people aren't going to give that up. And so we're headed for a world where people don't just suddenly come back to the office for 40, 50 hours a week. We're headed for a much more hybrid world whenever it's over. Now, I've been wrong about when it's over multiple times, to the point where I'm not even making predictions about COVID anymore, just making predictions about people's behavior, which is that they're going to think twice before signing up for how we used to work in 2019.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I think that within that, you mentioned about priorities and people having more of a focus on what's important to them. And certainly that's something that I pick up from a lot of people. The last 2 years, they've really realized what is key in their lives, and they've focused on that area. But I mean, I know for doing the job that you do as a writer and a speaker, I mean, I would assume that, having a strong focus and being solid in your priorities is a strength you had, before all this happened. So was it something, were those skills able to move over into the last few years, or was it something you had to work on at all?
Yeah, it's weird, right? So I was a business school professor most of my time until about 2016, when the books and demand for speaking and trainings and that sort of stuff outweighed it, and I stepped back from B school. And so I've been working mostly from home since 2016, right? So I was just sort of like, hey, you all get to realize my life. Now, I will tell you, what I was not used to was working from home with 2 other tiny humans that are normally in school while I'm working, in and around, interrupting, stealing my bandwidth, right? Like just scheduling when people are allowed to be online so we can maximize bandwidth for video presentations and that sort of stuff. Those were all new habits, right? And I think, that led to needing to draw some boundaries. I think one of the big realizations I had prior was that we used to have a really set rhythm because of that, right? Because I'd be at home, everybody else in the family would be at work or at school, et cetera. So boundaries were really easy. It took a while to set them properly. And then you stumble into the realization that you don't make boundaries because people are sort of less important. You make them because they're so important that you want to be able to focus on them when you're near them. Like I learned, for example, that I had to be in specific sections of the house when I was working, because if I was sitting at the dining room table trying to get emails done, a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old don't recognize the signs. And so they come and interrupt you, and you go, okay, well, this is actually, it's not their fault. It's my fault. So I need to be focused on them when I'm around them. And then I need to physically move myself in order to create a boundary when I'm not. And what's funny is I would start talking about that and giving speeches and doing trainings and that sort of stuff. And lots of other people, it was like they'd never heard it before. And you're like, look, don't be so hard on yourself, because I worked from home for 5 years before I figured that out. Right. So the fact that I'm telling you 5 months into this whole thing, you're one of the lucky ones.
No, it's very true. And I mean, I think there's a book that I read a number of years ago. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called The One Thing by Gary Keller. But,
and Jay Papasan. Yeah, Jay's an old buddy. Yeah.
And I really liked their thought process on the common phrase of the work-life balance, saying, well, actually, the reality is you don't really want a balance because nothing exciting happens at the balance. It's making sure when you are you say you're working, you're fully focused on work, and then when you're with your family, you're fully focused on family rather than trying to have dinner with your family and having one eye on your iPhone trying to check your emails. And it sounds aligns to what you mentioned there. It's if you can get that into that routine of having a workspace, having a family space, having your exercise space, whatever it may be, then you just try to. It helps with that focus, and it helps with, I think, having a happier lifestyle generally, I would say. But it sounds like you've cracked that side of it quite well.
Yeah, I mean, through trial and error, there's actually some really interesting research in that regard. Even before the pandemic, I wrote about this for HBR, I think in 2017, 2018. Essentially, before the pandemic, people had two different approaches to work and life, right? They were balancers and integrators, right? Balancers were, I leave for work, I'm totally focused on work until I return home, right? Mm-hmm. And integrators were largely people who were working from home, maybe people who were working off hours, people who were having to fit it less cleanly into their calendar and having to build those boundaries that we talked about. Now, what's interesting about the research supports that integrators respond better to disruptions, to interruptions than balancers, right? The balance approach of I'm fully focused on work, it works great until your school calls and your kid has a fever, right? Mm-hmm. It works great until your wife calls and she was just in a fender bender, right? Or something like that. When life suddenly interrupts itself into your work, or vice versa, when work suddenly interrupts, hey, I need you to be on a plane tomorrow because we got to go rescue this account, right? The balancers respond much more poorly to that than the integrators. And I think part of that is a realization that integrators just recognize we live in a world where I have to juggle all these things, but also they've actually built better friction. They've built better ways of compartmentalizing those things in their mind because they've been faced with it instead of just trying to block it out by balancing. And I think that's a lot of what we went through in March, April 2020 is a lot of the balancers were like, oh my gosh, all my worlds are colliding. Well, they were always colliding. You just escaped to an office to be able to prevent that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you mentioned earlier, it takes time to learn this new way of working. I mean, obviously, you've been doing this for a number of years, the home working, and myself, I've really since 2008, the majority of the time, my week was half at home, half in the office, and I think, but it does take time to change the habits that are ingrained in you that you built in your life for the last 10, 15, 20 years, whatever it is. But I think when you're able to do that, then you get a better lifestyle and a happier one. So it's good to see that things are going very, very well for you. And we'll obviously, I know one of the things you've been busy doing is writing leading from anywhere, which we'll obviously talk about very shortly. Just before we get into that, something maybe a light-hearted way to get into some of the questions. As I mentioned earlier, the show is in partnership with Operation Smile, and if you're not aware of them, or any of the listeners are not aware of these guys, they're a medical charity that help children in developing countries who have cleft lip and palate needs. And given that the company is named Operation Smile, I always like to ask the guests when they come on, what was the last thing that made you smile? So maybe that's a good way to get into the questions, David.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what, I'll give you two because one's a little bit lighter. I mean, the deeper one would be probably the last time I had a big smile. My son actually caught me doing it the other day. My older son is 9 years old. And you have all these memories of your kids when they were sort of toddlers or kindergartners, et cetera. And he flashed me this look yesterday that reminded me that even though he's almost like he's fourth grade or fifth grade, like he's almost a middle schooler, right? He's getting older, et cetera. He flashed me this look that I hadn't seen since he was probably a kindergartner. And just seeing him, being able to see him as that young again, made me smile. And then he caught me on it. So then he was like, what's so funny? Why are you smiling? Why are you laughing? I was like, I don't even know how to explain this to you, right? Because if you don't have children, you don't get it. The other big one, speaking, I guess, also of kids, we went our first post-COVID movie theater experience. We saw that new Spider-Man movie, which I apologize if you haven't seen it. I will spoil it for you. But they did a brilliant job of bringing the other two superheroes from past Spider-Man movies in. So I felt like I was watching it as an adult and as like a graduate student, which I think I was when the first one came out. Like there was like a 20-year history that they play, and it just worked beautifully. So that movie, I smiled the whole time through.
No, that's good. I mean, it's one thing you can always guarantee with with young children especially is that they often bring smiles to your faces. They can
For
also
sure.
bring frowns to your face, but most of the time they can bring you smiles. And I tend to I was someone the other day was saying that their happiness is directly related to the happiness of their children. You know, if the children are happy, they're happy. If they're unhappy, then they're unhappy. And I think with you mentioning, obviously, you're very close to your children. With the time you're working from home, it's hopefully makes for a very happy household most of the time.
Most of the time, yeah. I was going to correct you. I don't know that I would say they make you frown. Grimace, maybe, right? But yeah.
That's true. Well, as we mentioned earlier, I know you've been putting this time in the last few years to good use with the book that you released around this time last year, Leading from Anywhere. And I thought, obviously, given that it's such a big discussion points at the moment with the majority of people in our network. I thought really we should spend a large part of the podcast really discussing the book that you've written on this subject. So, I mean, maybe as a starting point, what inspired you to write the book? Because I guess it's one of those things. A lot of people are aware that there are challenges for leaders leading remotely, but then the majority of people then don't go out and write a book about it. So what was it that led you in this direction?
Yeah, so this is one of those necessity is the mother of inspiration or innovation ideas. So I will tell you, I was not planning on writing this book before the pandemic, obviously, right? That's the grand secret. And neither was pretty much anybody else who's written a book about remote in the last 2 years. But I was working on a lot of research in and around teams. I was actually I was sort of dripping what is now my current project, but has been on the back burner for 2 years, out in a couple different ways. Like I had just released in partnership with Audible, this little 2-hour audio program that was sort of one element of this greater research project around teams and what makes for a thriving team culture and that sort of a thing. And this is not new, right? I mean, I wrote about in my first book, which was in 2013. It's probably the most highlighted part. It was on creativity and innovation, but the most highlighted sentence in that whole book, if you look at the Kindle highlights, is creativity is a team sport, right? And Under New Management was about how teams and how companies have to change certain management practices, and how one of the things we talk about there is that the building block of an organization, in my opinion, isn't the job anymore. It's the project and the team that comes around that project, right? And so it used to be that companies were bundles of jobs. Now they're what projects are you actually taking on, right? And in Under New Management, we talk a lot about companies that were either fully remote or had a much more freedom and autonomy, like a results-only work environment, which used to be the case back at Best Buy, et cetera. We talked a lot about those sort of practices. But I was working on the teams thing and the team culture thing. And then the pandemic happened. I learned that it's a really bad idea to launch an audio original 2 weeks before a pandemic that ruins everyone's commute, because they stopped downloading audiobooks. They stopped downloading podcasts. You probably saw that with your podcast. March, April, May of 2020 was a terrible time to be in audio. But around May, I was in a conversation with the editor from Under New Management. And, he said, look, I'll be totally transparent. We think there's a business opportunity in writing a book about remote. And I'm like, well, you're probably right. The problem is there's already a ton of stuff out there, right? So there was already in how to run a fully remote organization. There were multiple books by like Jason Fried and David Hannemeyer Hansen about how they ran Basecamp and how to be productive and working from home. I mean, there's no shortage of books and courses and all of that sort of stuff on that. But ironically, and maybe this was a bit of my bias because of what my own research project was on, I said, I don't know of a single book on remote that's focused on the team level. Like, what does it mean I had a team that all worked together in a co-located environment, and suddenly I'm a remote manager, and I didn't ask for that. But for the next few months or years, my team will be remote or even sort of flexible and hybrid. Right? There wasn't really anything looking at that team level. There was individual productivity and there was high level, how do you run a whole company? And I said, I think there's an opportunity there if you're interested. And they came back and were like, yeah, we're interested. Do you want to write that book? And so that we signed a deal in late May, early June 2020 for that book. And I had 8 weeks to write it.
Wow.
I leaned, you're right. So I leaned very, very heavily on a lot of the pre-pandemic research that we had already talked about in Under Management. I went back and interviewed a lot of the companies that I interviewed in Under Management and asked them less about how they're organizing the whole company and more about individual team dynamics and that sort of stuff. And so we wrote that with the intent. It came out in January of 2021. So a little over a year now, and it's been an absolutely wild ride. And I think there's two things that I sort of realized in writing that book that I think are true in the long term. First of all, like I already said, it was summer of 2020 that I had the great realization that like we're not all going back. We're headed for a place where people are going to want flexibility, whether that's a couple days working from home, whether that's working only 4 hours instead of 8 hours at the office. Every company, every team is going to have a little bit different, but we have to be what we ended up calling a from anywhere approach to work. The other realization was that I was sort of onto something, I think, in this team's dynamic, because if you think about, I never expected this. When I started writing Leading from Anywhere, it was about how do you manage a remote or a hybrid team. And we were in the midst of a recession globally because of the pandemic and the responses to the pandemic, where people were laying off members of their team, right? So, and I threw in as a whim a little bit about how you hire as a team, but I never expected it. I worked with one organization in late 2020 that went from 50 employees to 210 employees during the pandemic, right? Now, some of that was already pre-planned growth. It wasn't like they weren't like a testing company, for example. But the majority of people who worked for that company had never been to headquarters, didn't go to the giant orientations that we think about in large organizations, right? Their entire experience of what it is to work for that company was this 5 or 6 people on their team that they worked with every day. And I think that's true, not even for new hires, because now we've been at this for almost 2 years. That's true for most people. The entirety of an employee experience or what an employee's approach to team culture is filtered through and probably 75 to 80% affected by the team culture, not what the organization does, right? So it really, I think, highlights that this from anywhere world actually makes drilling down and focusing in on the teams that people are on and team level, middle level leadership even more important, because those are the big drivers of culture now. It's not what you do at a senior level, because you can't possibly touch and affect the lives of all people. It's what you do at a senior level to help individual team leaders have a positive culture. That's what's going to matter much more.
Mm-hmm. No, it's really interesting, because it's the kind of I know it's a regular challenge that a lot of people have when I talk to them on a day-to-day basis. How do we manage and motivate the teams, and how do we get most out of people? I know one of the biggest challenges I think a lot of leaders have faced is the uncertainty around the whole situation in the last 2 years. And I think, when it was the case where everybody was working from home, it was easier to manage people than when you have a situation like we have now. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, that's going to continue, where they're flexible working. But what that means is, obviously, on one day, you're going to have one group of people in the office, on another day, another group of people. So if you want to do anything as a team, you're likely to have a good percentage of your team not with you and a good percentage with you. So there's a different way of doing it now, because not everyone is at home now. There's that mix, and that's one of the biggest challenges I know a lot of the leaders I've worked with have faced over the last few years.
Yeah, I am really worried about that. Not from a top performer level. I am from a how do you retain your top performers, right? Because they've got the freedom to kind of go to whatever work arrangement works for them. But I worry about it throughout the whole organization for a couple of reasons. Hybrid is certainly harder than everyone being remote, right? I worry about the potential to have a new silo or a new bias towards, if you're one of the people that's in the office all of the time versus the people that are remote most of the time, an us versus them that can kind of creep in, right? Because organizations are no strangers to silos. They've just usually been functional, not presence-based, right? So I worry about that. I worry that most leaders are still not grasping what is meant by from anywhere, or what is meant by flexibility and autonomy. So I interact with a lot of organizations that when I ask, what's your return to work plan, or what's your future of work plan, or your flexible work plan, et cetera, they say, oh yeah, we're going to a flexible work policy where people can opt in to spending Thursday and Friday working from home. And I'm like, I lost the part of that was flexible. What part of that was flexible? Right? Or like, I mean, essentially their flexible work policy is we'll dictate when you're here and you need to be flexible to make that work, right? That's not what, that won't work, right? At a senior leadership level, what we ought to be doing is setting the guide rails of saying, look, we know that we function best if people can at least interact 2 to 3 days a week. So we'd like everybody to only take a maximum of 2 days, let's say, from the office. But you need to work with your teams or your business units to come up with what works best for your team in terms of what that means. Because some teams want to be able to have touch points every single day. Some are going to want to say Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Some are going to want to say Thursday and Friday from the office. But every team's a little bit different based on what projects they're working on, who's on it, et cetera. And you have to really decide that at a team-wide level. The only thing I think you can do at a senior level is set the guide rails. But you have to set it at a team-wide level. And again, the reason I'm worried about that for 2 reasons. One is that I don't see a lot of organizations doing that compared to the norm of just saying, oh, you can opt into 2 days a week from home. The other thing I worry about is that if every team is going to be different, we go back to this question of us versus them. Grass is always greener in somebody else's flexible work policy on a different team, right? And so recognizing that this is not like, we need to get into this mentality where time that you're not working at the office or time that we are working in the office, it's not a proxy for productivity. It's not a proxy for commitment, et cetera. It's because your team figured out when they work best together and when they work best isolated and focused, which is usually means remote. But it's at the team-wide level and it's about building what's best for them. And hopefully that's still seen as an egalitarian approach, right? Because equality is not necessarily treating everyone the same, right? It's treating everyone fairly, giving everyone what they actually need to succeed, which means they might actually end up being treated differently in order to be treated fairly.
Mm-hmm. No, a lot of this rings true to actually a podcast that I did yesterday. So we had one of the HR leaders from Novartis in Switzerland on the podcast, and they have, I mean, their recruitment and retention is really top class. Really, I think they not only get the best talents in, but their people stay within that business for a long time, and that's continued through the last couple of years. And one of the ways that they've done this is they have how meetings with their individuals in their teams, and they usually they get their managers to spend around 2 hours with each individual and try to make every question begin with a how. So it's, how can I help you in the best way? How do you see this role developing? And you almost, in a way, the person in the team is then being a lot more open with the manager. You find out a lot more about not just what they want to do in work, but what they want to do in outside of work, the hours they want to work, what they want to bring to the role. And that, I mean, that is the first time I've heard of that example, but it seems to work really well. And I think a very good good idea, but quite aligned with what you've been saying there, that you've got to listen to each individual. And even if it's not what you want to necessarily hear, if it's somebody who wants to keep happy and keep in the team, then you've got to have that level of flexibility, or you face potentially losing them, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I'm probably going to steal that, to be honest with you.
So am I for EMEA. I think I thought it was a great idea. I mean, I think and it's proven that it's working very well. So
it speaks to, when I look at, I think painting with a broad brush is always dangerous. But when I look at what individual managers or individual leaders have done well over the past 2 years versus the ones that have really struggled, I actually boil it down into 2 different mentalities, right? Some people have the mentality that their people work for them. So they talk about the people who work for them. And some people have the mentality that their people work with them. And that's an entirely different leadership mentality, right? If you think your people work for you, then your job is to allocate resources, track progress, give constructive feedback, blah, 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 right? If you think that your people work with you, then you think your job is, how can I help you? How can I get you the resources that help you do your best work? How can I remove the roadblocks that are preventing you from doing your best work, right? It's a very, very different mentality. And guess which one thrives better in an environment where you don't get to see your people every day, right? It's obviously the with mentality. So I love that how interview idea, because it's very representative of that idea that people work with you. If anything, you work for them.
Yeah, no, it's true. So, yeah, it's a very changing world that's happened in the last few years, I think. But it was all leading this way, I feel. But actually, the whole COVID thing has just accelerated it even more. You know, I think you do see that a lot. So, I guess one of the challenges is, I mean, these things that they sound when we're talking about them, they sound, you know, relatively straightforward and sometimes actually quite obvious, you know, when you're talking about it. But actually, we know that it's harder to actually implement these ideas or get the consistency behind these ideas. So I was wondering, without giving too much away, but in your book, whether you found there was one or two really great case studies that excelled in this, and what made them different from the people that struggles to do this.
Yeah, well, you know, I think in terms of case studies, actually, my favorite example of all of the organizations profiled in the book is a pre-pandemic, very, very old example, because it gets at what we're talking about. And it's, if you've never researched, it's very, very well worth reading the full case studies on this man named Frank van Massenhoven, who was put in charge of the Belgian Ministry of Social Security, right? So in other words, the kind of the pensioners fund, the government-run pensioners fund, which in basically every Western world is like the most boring of all of the bureaucracies, right? Here in the US where I am, it's called the Social Security Administration. It's sort of a dead-end government job, right? But he was put in charge of it, and he wanted to really kind of make it a place that people were actually energized and inspired to work, et cetera, a place where it led from trust and autonomy. And as a result, it ended up being a primarily remote job. So there were offices, but people on any given day, only about 20% of people were there, et cetera, right? So in terms of case studies, like I'd love people to read the book so they get that one. But even if you just Google it, he gave a TEDx talk and all that sort of stuff. And I cite that because it's an example of what we're talking about here. Remote didn't force you to do this. If you were doing this anyway, you head that way. So I would go there in terms of case studies. In terms of making it really, really practical, beyond just case studies, like activities that you can do. I will give you two to really look at that. We talk about both of these in the book a little bit. The first would be instituting some sort of team-wide huddle, which you may already do, but most teams have, you know, a once a month or once a week, hours-long team meeting with multiple things on the agenda. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is an activity or an exercise where the team can work out loud, can broadcast what they're working on. I stole the questions that are often used in the world of agile and software development from the Scrum, they call it, which are the three questions. What did I just complete? What am I focused on next? And what's blocking my progress? And I've seen teams that were sort of weird and isolated and jumped in for those meetings and everyone turned their cameras off, et cetera, that would start doing that on a weekly basis. Like every Monday morning, send an email out to the team. Here's what I did last week. Here's what I'm focused on this week. And here's where I need help, right? Here's what's blocking my progress. And the team, even the remote or the hybrid team, comes together probably even more bonded than if it were a co-located team, right? So I'm a huge fan of that at almost every level. And it's not trying to micromanage people. It's not because you don't trust them, et cetera. It's because people need to be aware of what everybody else on the team is working on towards a project so they can coordinate their efforts accordingly. So a team that works out loud is a team that works together. And I'm a huge fan of those huddles for that. The other thing, when you are doing those longer team calls, there's a difference between an efficiently run meeting and an effectively run meeting. And we're actually pretty good. It took 2 years of trial and error. We're pretty good at running efficient virtual meetings. We jump on, we wait maybe 1 or 2 minutes for that one person who can never figure out how to get the Wi-Fi to work, right? Come on. And then, you know, at 10:02, we start the meeting. The meeting's scheduled to go until 11. Right at 11, we're like, okay, we've hit all the agendas, et cetera. And then like, boom, you get that little white square that says this meeting has been ended by host. And you're reminded that you're alone in your guest bedroom, right? If you think about the dynamics of an in-person team meeting, they don't work that way. There are times in the meeting, usually before, usually after, where people are having unstructured conversations, more about what else is going on in their life conversations, et cetera. So in addition to huddles, my other big tip for a lot of leaders that are managing remote or hybrid is try and build some of that buffer time into the agenda. You will be less efficient because but spending 10 to 15 minutes, maybe it's before, maybe you do it like you jump on at 9:45 for the 10 o'clock meeting. And then you send an email out to your team that says, hey, I'm running early. Love to chat with anybody if you are too. And then a couple people jump on the line and you talk about how was your weekend? How was your holiday? You know, et cetera. Those build what in the psychology research we call uncommon commonalities, things that two people now have discovered about themselves. They both love. I mean, I told you earlier, one of the things that made me smile was a Marvel movie. I love superhero movies, right? If you're that case, if you're listening to this or watching this, you and I now have a connection that not everybody on the show does. We have an uncommon commonality. Building those on a team, that's the beginning of bonding. That's the beginning of friendships. That's the beginning of making the team kind of be something that's exhilarating to be a part of instead of just, you know, repetitive and drab. And we don't do that as much as we used to when we're in person, because we have to be deliberate about it in a remote or a hybrid environment instead of just letting it accidentally happen.
No, it's so true. You know, when you talk about it like this, because I mean, I think, you know, we're obviously talking about internal meetings with teams, but also I think it can work when you're meeting people from the external point of view on video conferencing. Because I mean, in reality, you know, if you're meeting someone in person, where, you know, most of the time you try to be 10 minutes early. I know one of my former colleagues had a phrase: if you're not 10 minutes early, you're 10 minutes late. And it's that kind of principle. If you treat your meetings internally and externally, you know, to get there on time, probably you should try to arrive 10 minutes early, and then you've got a bit of time to settle into the meeting, whatever. And it's that kind of principle, trying to treat these video conferencing meetings as much like meeting in person in the office as we used to, and then you can do that. But again, it's one of those things that I know, you know, a lot of listeners will who do that, you know, but I also know a lot of the listeners, they look at their diary every day and it's just back to back video calls. There's no gaps in between, and the diaries have ran away with them. But maybe that's a different topic to discuss on time management and priorities, though. That's
yeah, I mean, so that again, that speaks to the deliberateness element, right? We need to have a conversation at a team or probably an organization wide level about building in buffer times in between meetings. I mean, just so people have a chance to like get a bite to eat or run to the bathroom, right? But we need to kind of talk about that, or you know, my favorite hacks that I'm seeing in organizations now is you can get in at the network level and you can change all your Microsoft Office or Teams defaults for a 30-minute meeting to a 25 and for a 60-minute meeting to a 50. And seeing people kind of commit to that idea, I think works really, really well as a system-wide reminder, right, that we need to be building those buffer times in, because if you don't do it deliberately in a virtual environment, it doesn't happen. And I think for too long, we relied on culture to be built accidentally based on whether or not we were in person. And that's why so many people over the last 2 years have said, oh my gosh, what happens to our culture if we stay remote? We need to get everybody back so that we can build our culture. Like, no, you should have never been relying on culture to be built accidentally anyway. You should have been relying on it being deliberate.
Mm-hmm. No, it was interesting as well. I thought I'd ask a question. So aside from reading your book, if there was one thing you think remote leaders can do to be better at leading their teams remotely, and let's say a message you wanted somebody to take from this podcast, what do you think that could be?
Yeah, wow. I mean, I gave you two already, right? The huddles and the. Let's talk. You want one thing. You want the Gary Keller, Jay Papasan.
It is reversing back to that. I've just realized that. Yeah.
How about this? In addition to the other two things, here's the one thing. We need to have a conversation as a team about what topics and what communications can be asynchronous versus synchronous, right? For remote or hybrid to work, the bulk of your communication has to be asynchronous, has to be, and then when you are synchronous, it has to come in bursts, and then you let people have it, right? Because if you are like a lot of people, if your experience over the last 2 years of remote has been, I'm always just in back-to-back meetings, when are you ever actually getting real work done, right? And so we need to respect that and build that in. That comes in a variety of different forms. So for some teams, that is, let's have that conversation. You know, project updates and this need to be asynchronous, but when we need to generate ideas, we need to call a meeting for that, or so we can have that. What topics are asynchronous? Other teams have decided, okay, let's eschew that, and let's just say every Wednesday and Friday afternoon, no one's allowed to schedule a meeting, right? So every team, but the reason you do that is both to speed communication. We know from the research that more productive remote teams communicate in bursts, come together for short periods of synchronous communication and then long periods of asynchronous. But we also know that you need to protect your people's time so that they can focus on the work you actually hired them to do. So that comes in a variety of forms, but it probably needs to be a conversation we have at a team-wide level about how we're communicating so that we can collaborate more effectively.
Mm-hmm. There you go. So we've actually ended up with 3 things from you. Right. One, but that's good. So we've got 3.
I like threes. I'm a Trinitarian. I like threes.
So I mean, obviously we talked a lot about this book, The Leading from Anywhere, which I will obviously make sure we put the link on the podcast promotion when it goes out, and I know very relevant for today's world, and I know there's a lot of good information in there, and which you've touched the surface of today in a very relevant topic. And I thought, whilst you're on the podcast as well, I thought it made sense to ask you what you've got in the pipeline now. I mean, obviously, probably not as much travel as you might have done in the normal world, but what have you got lined up for 2022?
Yeah, so this is a research and writing year for me. I mean, there'll certainly be, as the world opens up, I don't know when that'll be. There'll certainly be travel and conferences and that sort of thing. But I am kind of going back to focusing in on, truthfully, on the project I was working on before, with a renewed lens about it, which is great. But going back into focusing on that deeper question, which is around what makes, I use this phrase often, best work ever, helping people do their best work ever. I'm trying to answer the question of what makes for the best team ever. What are the elements of a team culture that really explain how seemingly mediocre people can end up being the best performing team in an industry or a competitive environment or something like that. So I'm in the research phase of that. I typically spend about 6 months gathering as much research as possible, and then 6 months turning all of that into a book, and then probably another 6 months editing and preparing for marketing. Of course, I didn't get the chance to do any of that with Leading from Anywhere, but I'm still in that researching phase. So I'm collecting a lot of fun stories, trying to kind of construct it into a model that makes sense, compiling research, some of which people have heard about. Others, I mean, I'm finding some fascinating studies that I'd never heard about, and I have a PhD in this stuff, right? So that's been a lot of fun. But yeah, this is definitely a thinking and writing and researching year for me.
No, that's good. I mean, on the subject of research, I mean, typically, to be honest, this is a question I usually ask some of the guests who are in the finance or HR or supply chain, but I guess it could also be relevant for yourself, because I mean, obviously the impact of business intelligence, of data, and artificial intelligence is hits all of our lives, and it's something that's not going away. So it does have an impact on people's jobs and lives, and from a job point of view, it can often mean they're doing more research and desk evaluation than probably business partnering to some degree at the current stage. I mean, does all this sort of new way of working, does it make it easier for you to research because there's so much information at your fingertips, or can it make it harder because there is so much information and it's just working out where to start with it all?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. I would say it makes being really, really clear on the question you're asking more important, right? Because the question you're trying to find the answer to is what's going to help you sift through all of the available information. Having all of that at your fingertips, the ability to connect with people around the world and interview them or talk to them or read their research, et cetera, at any given time, is an incredible asset. But like you said, it can also be a crazy distraction. And it's how clear you are on, I'm looking specifically for this, right? And often, I mean, I'll tell you this from a business leadership standpoint, often we don't do that. Often we find a symptom, we realize we have a problem, and we go, okay, we need to do some research and solve that problem. Instead of, no, we need to examine that question a bit more and go back and go upstream and maybe figure out what is the thing we're actually trying to solve. Right. And then that helps us sift through that research. So that's that. So it's a blessing and a curse, but it makes me find that the importance of asking the right and a very specific question really important, because otherwise you just end up on all sorts of rabbit trails. And a decade later, you realize I'm still no closer to my answer, right?
So it's it can, as you say, it can be a blessing and a curse at the same time. And I guess what it does come down to is some things we touched on in the conversation already. It's having that that focus in your work, being able to set the priority on what you're really looking for, but also I think ultimately having the drive and determination to hit the deadlines and to get the work done. I mean, I think you mentioned earlier you had this deadline of 8 weeks to put this book together, and I think you tend to find that if a deadline is set too far in the distance, then it's harder than when it's actually set close up, because it means you have to get working on it, because you've got a very short period of time to work on these things. So good example of having a short deadline, what you can achieve in that time frame if you are very focused.
Yeah, and also having a very specific question, right? Like if you remember, I went back and did, I basically spent a weekend looking at what was currently available before I talked to the publisher, and noticed, okay, there's all of this high level stuff about how to run a whole organization. Really, they were like memoirs from remote first organizations, right? And then there was a lot of personal productivity stuff working from home, but nothing at that team level. What happens to the 6 to 8 people who all have to work together when they shift from remote? And so having that narrow of a focus is what really, really helped, right? And I think truthfully, it's also what's made the book kind of useful and practical for a lot of people. If you're a CEO of a 10,000 person company, I was about to say, I hope you don't read the book. I hope you do, but I hope you buy like 1,000 copies and give it to your team leaders and your business unit leaders, right? Because that's where I'm focused in on. And that really helped me filter through fast. If I were trying to do a broad survey of everything you need to know about a remote organization, like I'd still be writing that book, right? And COVID would be over by the time I got that one done.
That's it. And I thought actually, just on a similar topic to what we've been discussing earlier, obviously with the nature of the conversations about how great leaders can make their teams great, and so what makes great leaders in these areas to manage people remotely, and I think ultimately, when people do that, they're often in the mindset of their team for life, and they're always well thought of with the team around them for the work and help they're able to give. But and the line to this, you tend to find that most people, successful or not, have people that they look up to, they regard as mentors in their life, and I just wondered, from your point of view, is there any are there a couple of people that stand out to you as people who've really helped shape the direction of your life, your career, and who you regard as great mentors in your life?
Yeah. So I always struggle with this one, because I think I'm a much bigger fan of this idea of sort of having a board of advisors than 1 or 2 mentors, right? So I have probably 6 to 12 people, some of whom know, maybe because I've mentioned them on a podcast like this, and they happen to be listening to it. Some of whom don't know that, like, they're this person I have, but basically they're sort of who you want to become. And then usually that's a composite of the strengths and weaknesses of a lot of different people, right? Because most people that are great in one area maybe aren't that representative. And so when I was younger and more naive, I was more into sort of mentors, and then they would make decisions that were disappointing and you're like devastated. I don't know what to do, right? So I'm much more a bigger fan of that sort of board of advisors. I could give you a few names on that. I've always been a fan and always studied how people like Daniel Pink approach writing and structuring their books. I think he does a fascinating job on that. But it's people like Roger Martin who really push my thinking, right? And really encourage me to kind of reconcile mental models that seem conflicting and all of that sort of stuff. From how do you run sort of the business of thought leadership, I'm indebted to people like Liz Wiseman or Whitney Johnson, right? And so it's not one sort of mentor that's been this key person in my life. It's sort of like probably, like I said, 6 to 8, maybe even as far as 12, that are in different areas of my life. I have different questions, and they're the people that I know in my mind or who I go to. They're not formally like a board of advisors. We don't get together and go golfing every quarter and charge shareholders. But they're the people that I go to with very specific questions, and collectively I'm indebted to sort of all of them.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think all of you share in that accolade of being part of the Thinkers 50. I actually, the majority of people you mentioned there, you may or may not know they've been on the podcast in the past as well, which is
cool.
interesting. And I think it's so we spoke to Roger and Whitney and
sorry, I have to interrupt you because I realize you said Thinkers 50 and I realized I'm totally indebted. I should have mentioned Marshall Goldsmith. Because Marshall is the one that made me think of this. So Marshall called me in 2019 and invited me to join his MG 100, right? Which is this kind of collection of younger folks that before COVID, we would meet once a quarter and talk about a bunch of different stuff. And the network that Marshall created, I love Marshall and he's been very highly influential in my life too, but the network he created is how most of those connections were made. I don't know that Dan's in it, but everyone else I mentioned is also an MG 100 member. And so I'm indebted to them. And it's that community, in addition to the Thinkers 50 community, that I'm really indebted to in terms of pulling from for that board of advisors. Sorry, I totally cut you off there, but
no worries. No, you got to make sure you get Marshall's name in there.
Right? Yeah. No, I'd be totally mad at myself if we hung up and I forgot to mention Marshall. So Marshall, if you're watching this, I didn't forget you.
I guess I thought I'd just end the podcast with a fairly light-hearted question to end things as we started. When we were talking just there about the sort of influences in your life and career, and I know in this day and age on social media, especially, you see on a daily basis various different motivational quotes, being posted with fancy backgrounds and so on, and but I think everybody usually has one that stands out and actually works for them and they remember very well in their lives. So I didn't know if there was one motivational quote in particular that you feel actually has had an impact on you.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a really spacey answer here because this is how my mind works. You started talking about motivational quotes on Instagram, and actually my mind, for some reason, went to the windows at Disney World or Disneyland. If you've ever been to any of the Disney parks, you walk through Main Street and there's all of these little shops, and then above them are windows. And what most people don't know is the names on all of those windows. It's meant to look like signs advertising businesses, but they were influential people in the building of that park, right? Okay. And if you walk in the one in Orlando, if you walk in, and right as you walk in, you see this main square. And if you look up and to the right, you see my favorite window ever, which is advertising a fake business called Dreamers and Doers Production Company, Chairman Roy Disney. And so the park and the people at Disney really wanted to highlight Roy, who never gets the credit. It's always about Walt, but really wanted to highlight Roy. And I love that term, dreamers and do it. And then next to the window, it says, if we can dream it, we can do it, right? But I love this idea that in truth, you need sort of both. We all know that person in our life who is head in the clouds, dreamer, incredibly creative, but can't get any traction. And then we all know that person who's like Mr. or Ms. Productivity, who is always highly efficient, but is never. And in what I'm trying to do in my life and what I see most people who leave an impact on, they either were one of those who partnered with the other, like Walter Roy, or they developed both skills of being a dreamer and then also sort of being a doer. I realize that's not a quote other than if we can dream it, we can do it. But that's where my mind went. And it's totally different than like an inspirational Instagram quote. So apologies for being so spacey. But yeah, next, if you've never been, if you're watching this or listening, Google it. You can actually see pictures of those windows, et cetera. It's a really cool experience.
No, I like it. I think it's a great way to end the podcast, really. So obviously it's been, I've really appreciated your time today. I know the listeners will take a lot from this podcast discussion, as have I. I mean, I think obviously timing wise for the book to come out, it's still so relevant. So, I think, you never know when this whole situation is going to cease, but you can't see it's going to be something in the short term, as we talked about earlier with the flexible working and so on. So, a great publication to come out, which I'm sure a lot of the listeners will go on and listen to or read. So, just in case any of the listeners want to reach out to you directly, what's the best way they can do that?
I'm really, really fortunate in that Burkus is a really rare name. So davidburkus.com was available, and that is sort of the central hub for all things. There's more on the books there. There's a bunch of free resources around how do you do those less efficient meetings where you create buffer times and all sorts of stuff. How do you do those huddles? All of that's at davidburkus.com, as well as where to connect with me, either through there, sending me an email, or clicking over to one of those social accounts where we don't post motivational quotes. We post motivational videos. It's totally different. It's a totally different thing.
Well, great to have you on the show, Dave. Really appreciate it. And enjoy the rest of the day. And obviously, we'll keep in touch.
Yeah. Thank you again so much for having me.
No worries. Thanks, David. Cheers. Bye-bye. Bye.